Hello my friends, this is Dr. M supporting your journey, intermediate microeconomics, and we continue our discussion on financial economics. Last time we covered some discussion on interest rates, managerial compensation, and today we'll look into some of the details that determine the cash flow and associated variables such as default risk. So let's start with proposition, and we'll just start with an example. Let's suppose that you win the lottery and you are offered a choice between $10 million now or $250,000 a year for 40 years, beginning this year. Which choice would you make? And rational person would vote for $10 million now. Why? Simply because there is a stream of income that is offered to you in the amount of $250,000 a year from now for 40 years must be associated with a default risk. We talked about previously in relationship to intertemporal choice, the trade-off between today and tomorrow, or present versus future. And because future is not guaranteed for anybody, there is a risk associated with any pledge that is made association with the future. Therefore, if you were to take the present value of this stream of income, $250,000 a year from now for 40 years, it will actually be less than $10 million now. And from economic perspective, you of course take a big amount, which is $10 million now. So one thing that would be interesting to reconcile here is advertising. Because essentially you could advertise a product or a service that is associated with trade-off between today and tomorrow. And that's been done all the time. If you make through the advertising the pledge of money believable, that's what matters. In some ways, as long as people believe that the company has a future, they would be willing to invest. You can think about Arthur Andersen Company, where the company advertised itself in relationship to a variety of different products and different engagements related to lucrative business deals. Or Enron, for instance, would be another example. And investors continue to invest the money because advertising brought this notion of future stream of income believable. And as long as people have this perception of the future that it will come, and it will come with a certain benefits attached, people will tend to buy that and engage in such trade-offs. By default, the more you sell, the more you benefit. That leads me to conclude that each advertising campaign will have some misleading elements. Because from economic perspective, the more you sell, the better you are off. It leads you to cross this line where you may want to mislead the public because it is going to push the product oftentimes that they don't really want or they don't really need. So let's look into this a little bit closer. Undeniably, each advertising campaign within the marketing domain is designed to excite. So when people advertise, or when people or companies advertise and try to push the product or service, they want to excite the public. And this excitement must be coming along with making the pledge of money believable. And that brings an interesting relationship between advertising and default risk. Will the excitement level depend upon the probability of default? Absolutely. Because when somebody makes the future payoffs as the pledge believable, that in essence changing perception of the default risk. So marketing with advertising campaign in essence does impact the default risk of any pledge that is associated with the future payments. That brings us to an interesting statement. Ex post contractual opportunistic behavior. Basically, ex post contractual opportunistic behavior means if somebody can screw you after the contract is made, they will. And basically, that is direct relationship with intertemporal choice. If they find a way to default on the promise, they will. And that often comes with incentive that people have. Now, let's do a little bit of integration of faith and learning here. Religious beliefs are intrinsic part of intertemporal choice because people think that they have a future including life after death. And this trade-off between the present, what you do, what you say at present, has some consequences in the future, including the life after death, must have impact on default risk. Stated differently, what would prevent a person to act is according to ex post contractual opportunistic principle? If the religious belief is such that person cannot afford to have somebody led into deception, to screw somebody, put it simply, then you can say with confidence that religious beliefs is solving ex post contractual opportunistic problem. However, even those who are devoutly religious still behave according to ex post contractual opportunistic behavior principle, which means, and that's called sin within the religious domain. So whenever people engage in at-risk behavioral choices according to ex post principle, they commit sin. Granted, you would rather deal with somebody who is trying to avoid ex-post contractual opportunistic choices versus someone who has no incentive to do so. And religious beliefs provide the foundation to solve, or at least mediate, ex-post contractual opportunistic behavior. Let's do an example. Publishing business. How do they solve ex-post problem? Let's suppose that I write a book and I go to the publisher to sign a contract to publish my book, and the publisher is taking on expenses to publish my work, to distribute, to advertise, and whatever else is involved in delivering my book to the readers, maybe transportation cost and such. How would the publisher make sure that I'm not going to engage in ex-post contractual opportunistic behavior against them? In other words, how would they make sure that I don't go to another publisher and strike a similar contract with them and then go to another publisher and do the same thing with another publisher? So, in other words, I could collect the benefits from different publishing venues. Clearly, publishers are still around and they still publish books because they did solve the problem. And one of the ways that they solve this problem is called royalties. They essentially award the author with some percentage that will come to be collected from the sale of the product or that particular book. And that will prevent me to go to another publisher while engaging in ex-post contractual opportunistic behavioral problem. Just like we discussed in previous videos, when company represented by the owners facing agency problem with managers, they supply stock option. Similar in this case. You provide incentive for people to avoid ex-post contractual opportunistic behavior, and they do less of it. Do they break the contracts? Yes. But it's still mitigating the problem. And of course, devoted religious belief is designed by default to incentivize people to behave according to certain values, according to certain moral principles. And that is directly solving ex-post problem. Here's another example. Aluminum plant generally takes a lot of electricity to run. So if aluminum plant is built prior to striking contractual deal with power company, there is a good chance that the power company will take advantage of this sunk cost and will charge higher prices for supplying electricity to aluminum plant. So before aluminum plant is even designed or built, they start working on engaging with power company to supply electricity at a certain fixed rate. for one reason, to avoid ex post problem. Sometimes companies engage in creating a third party in order to address ex post problem. So they can create insurance company like MetLife was created for that reason, because it allowed two partners to own an insurance company, and thus ownership prevented those two partners or more to default upon each other, and thus the risk was reduced. Fidelity Investment, Nations Bank, those companies were created for that reason. So I wanted to conclude this presentation with the statement that default risk is an intrinsic part of intertemporal choice. And let me go to my notepad to illustrate this a little bit more clearly. When you are looking at the present value of future denominated asset, you essentially discount it by 1 plus interest rate, and n is the number of years. So essentially, this nominal interest rate or discounting interest rate is comprised of real interest rate plus expected inflation and default risk. This is your default risk. So you see that the relationship between presently dated goods and future dated goods directly related to the interest rate, which in turn is the function of default risk. And at that point, I would like to wish you a healthy day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, my friends.